Hi, I'm Nozipho Shabalala and welcome to this Foresight webinar. It's all about Retail Reinvented, brought to you by Fortress REIT. Now, in attendance today, we have Fortress REIT's clients, brokers, financial analysts, property partners, and key players in media, locally and internationally in the property, retail, and logistics ecosystem, together exploring growth and innovations in the retail space. We're coming to you courtesy of Fortress REIT, South Africa's leading logistics and retail real estate group, for an insightful session of growth powering insights as we unpack the opportunities that exist within the retail market and how we can uplift and empower communities. And so in this session, we're going to be touching on the changing dynamics within retail in South Africa and how it can be a force for good in 2022 and beyond. Our aim today is to leave you feeling really inspired by the opportunities available in the retail sector and the new opportunities and innovations that are leading the charge. So very shortly, we're going to be hearing from Fortress REIT CEO, Stephen Brown. Straight after that, we're going to be crossing over to a panel discussion with Fortress REIT's Executive Director, Vuso Majija, in conversation with the CEO of Unjani Clinics, Linda Toussaint, Tim White, the CEO of Profika, and Vuyiswa Ramakgopa of the South African Institute of Black Property Practitioners. And they're going to be talking about opportunities for growth in the resale tech sector, what trends they foresee coming into play this year, and what the future looks like in this ever-growing and ever-changing space. And don't forget, if you like what you hear, you can access more growth-empowering insights by giving Fortress REIT Limited a follow on LinkedIn. With that, let's get right into it. It's over to you, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Nozipho, and thank you to all of our panelists, to Vuyiswa, who's a non-executive director on our board, to Vuso Majija, who is our retail executive, and to Linda and to Tim. Thank you very much for all of your thought-provoking insights into retail and the communities in which we operate and own assets. I think what's really been pleasing to see over the last few years, and certainly aligned with our CSI initiatives, is really a focus in and around the communities in which we have the fixed assets. And as we've said before, those assets are bound to the soil in which they operate and are an integral part of the communities. I think as we've seen COVID progress, I mean, this time, roughly 2 years ago, we were all in a hard lockdown. We could barely leave our homes for anything but the essential goods. And I think what we have seen is a complete reinvention of retail, and it really has become a source for communities of not only social engagement, but where they get their primary goods and services. And certainly the retail assets that we have, I think, serve a large community base. And I think we've spent a lot of time focusing on those communities and on the people, and also that guides a lot of our CSI investments. So we hope you've enjoyed the webinar today, and we hope you get a lot of insights from it.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this webinar, we're tapping into insight, opinion, and wisdom of Fortress REIT's key stakeholders, and we're focusing on the power of retail and its potential to uplift and empower communities and increasingly become a force for good in 2022 and beyond. The big question that we're seeking to answer today is, what role can retail play in serving their communities in a way that still makes commercial sense for everyone? And where do the opportunities lie to grow? Now, stepping into this conversation with me is Tim White. He is the CEO of Profika. So big welcome to you, Tim. Linda Toussaint is the CEO of Unjani Clinics. And we're really interested in hearing Linda's perspective and her experience. Vuyiswa Ramakgopa joins us today. She's the CEO of the South African Institute of Black Property Practitioners, and she is joining us in the conversation today and really going to bring a really interesting lens into the conversation. But certainly Vuso Majija is with us as well. He's, of course, the Executive Director at Fortress REIT. A big welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for this conversation. I'm going to get right into it, and maybe, Tim, I want to get to the core of it, because I want to talk about community engagement, because we all know that community engagement, it's a cumulative process. It can be a difficult process where we have to build trust and we have to work on that trust and that relationship over time. So practically speaking, how does this work when we see developments like malls coming into a planned area? How do you go about actually bringing in the needs of the community into the planning process? How you ensure that their voices are heard and they're being considered? And maybe as a last thought on this, Tim, that you can also touch on, what do you see as the benefits of good community engagement throughout the development process? It's a stack of questions, but I think it's a good way of opening up this conversation.
Thanks, Nozi. It's an interesting one. And, ultimately, these malls become the centers of action, or CBDs, in township or rural areas. And so the community engagement is so critical to making them a success. And I go back, to one of the projects that we were involved in almost 10 years ago, actually, in Gugulethu Square. It was a large 30,000 square meter shopping center. It was a joint venture between a developer and a corporate social responsibility fund. And community engagement was critical from the start. And it was really around identifying what needs the community required, and not just doing a bog standard mall with 95% national tenants, but how do you relate the retailers in the shopping center to that local community? How do you bring in traders and some informal traders that have previously traded in the area, try and include them into the shopping center and really create this CBD, and a community center essentially is what you need to do. Of course, job creation is a massive component of it, of building the center, but also ensuring that during trading that, the majority of people working in the shopping center are from the community. And as we know, with some of the challenges that we have with shopping centers and construction, there are sometimes quite a few protests and issues with the local community, and one needs to get over that. I mean, we read about it quite a lot recently about the construction mafia and things like that are happening. But again, going back to this particular project, right from the start, we engaged with the democratic structures in place, with the ward councillors, and we advertised for artisans, for local subcontractors, and went through quite a rigorous process of identifying who had the skills and setting up training programs for the local community. So by the time we started construction, anybody wanting to take on the developer had to actually go through the community structures that were already in place. And it was quite difficult for them to demand work when, for the 3 months prior to start of construction, there's been adverts going out and the community has been engaged through the ward councillors and the various structures. So that was really one way of getting it, ensuring that the project side of the development worked really effectively from start to finish. And then I think the other thing is around ownership. If a community doesn't feel like it's their center, and then it really becomes a problem, and you lose your customers, and of course then it's not a successful development. So there's certain ways of doing that. I mean, there's some softer issues around even art, local artists being included into doing some work in the centers. I mean, in one project, we had an instance where the local community could actually come and put handprints on the walls, so that week after week and months later, they could show their friends, the children could show their friends where their hands were. And it just, things like that, where you just pull the community into the development, makes it a lot easier, obviously, in terms of making it a success.
Yeah, Tim, it's such a beautiful response, because it really speaks to the impact of engagement, buy-in. You also spoke about ownership and what's possible when we are very deliberate about building those relationships and very deliberate about being in a real partnership with the community. And I know that you've also touched, of course, on some of the social unrest, and we're going to get to some of that a little bit more. But maybe let me come to Linda next, because Linda, one of the interesting perspectives that we're really wanting to get from you is looking at the trend of government institutions and clinics in your case moving into mall spaces rather than the traditional aging infrastructure or hospital spaces. The big question to you is, firstly, what is the appeal of moving into retail spaces? And then how would you describe the impact that has on the community of having access to public health services located in retail?
Thanks very much, Nozi. Yeah, I can't speak on behalf of government, given that, I can speak on behalf of Unjani Clinics, the network. That is a private clinic network that serves the public patient. But I know for a fact that a number of the government policy or programs that they're bringing in, such as the CCMDD pickup points, which is their chronic program, are moving into mall spaces. And I understand that that would be as a result of convenience for the patient to collect their chronic medication from a community mall on their way from home or to go to work or coming back from work. So I think convenience plays a huge role in terms of the government's idea of utilizing those spaces. So malls, as Tim said, generally centrally placed within a community or a main transportation route for taxis and buses. So placing clinics in those spaces makes it a lot more convenient for our clients and patients that visit the Unjani clinics. I think, the attractiveness for us when we originally looked at placing some of our Unjani clinics into parking spaces of malls, we're not actually in the actual retail centers, was firstly footfall, because you have got a lot of people that go through those spaces. Also security. Your malls have security that then allows it to be a more of a secure place for the nurse to actually operate her clinic. And then, of course, we have a number of initiatives with some of the property developers where they provide the space to the nurse rent-free, which then, for a nurse who's opening a small business, makes a huge difference to her operating costs of her business. We as Unjani empower Black women professional nurses to operate and own their own clinic in these low-income communities. And for us, it's about enhancing access to primary health care to those communities in a convenient way, reducing waiting times and transportation costs. So using retail spaces enhances that convenience quite significantly.
So what I'm hearing you say, Linda, it's on the one hand, there's convenience, but we're seeing some real spillover benefits into the community itself. And again, you speak about location and being close to transport routes and all of those elements that really begin to color the picture more meaningfully. But Vuyiswa, one of the things that I think has been consistent from what we've heard from Tim, from what we've heard from Linda, is partnerships. And the fact that there's got to be partnerships that work between the public sector, the private sector, as well as the community. I think my question to you is, how do we get it right? How do we make sure that those partnerships are meaningful, they're safe, and they lead to rewarding retail experiences? Almost like putting all of these strands together so that we can really see a win-win-win for all the stakeholders involved.
Yeah, absolutely, Nozi. And I mean, as the previous two speakers have been talking, I've certainly been kind of resonating with everything that they've been saying. And I mean, I think Tim touched on it specifically around the level of sort of upfront engagement that needs to happen long before, we even break ground. Or developers even break ground. And certainly, I think one level of that is engagement with the community via whatever community forums are available. But certainly another aspect of that is indeed that upfront engagement with the municipality. The municipality has such a critical role to play, and it is the job of government and the municipality to ensure that the social needs are met. And I mean, that is government's primary responsibility, to ensure that, the community is served, that infrastructure is provided, and that social needs are met. And of course, it is the role of the developer to put up a retail development or whatever it is they're doing. However, there is a space in between. And I believe that, that gap can be closed by having adequate upfront engagement, understanding what the needs of both parties are, understanding what the needs of the community are, and balancing those needs through those upfront negotiations. And that can pan out in different ways. I mean, it could see itself being certain concessions that are made by the developer or financial contributions that are made towards infrastructure development, going over and above that which is required for the actual development. It could also see itself manifested in terms of what Linda was talking about, where perhaps the developer can agree to perhaps house a facility that delivers social services. So there are such negotiations that do take place and that do happen. But I certainly think, government has to also step up and be able to play its role effectively. And I think in many cases, that's where we are falling short. We don't necessarily always have people sitting within municipalities who have the technical capabilities and are able to negotiate at that level. So we need to ensure that government is well capacitated, that the people who are sitting in those municipalities and approving those developments understand how the development process works and understand what actually needs what needs need to be met and how that can be done. They need to have research and data available to them, and there needs to be facilitation of discussion, constructive discussion and engagement between the private players and government and, of course, the community.
That's a really interesting way of framing it, Vuyiswa. And Vuso, I want to come to what Vuyiswa describes as the gap that needs to be closed. She talks about new ways of engagement. She talks about new ways of negotiating. And it almost suggests that we have to unlearn and find new ways of really creating these partnerships with communities. My question to you is that, do you have an example that you can share with us where you've had to pause, pivot, and review the retail model as we know it, so that you're really stepping into a place where you're serving your communities a bit more?
I think so far what I've heard from the panelists is spot on, and I couldn't agree anymore. From a retail point of view, I think our aim is obviously to work together with the various stakeholders to improve people's quality of life. So by its nature, retail needs to evolve, and we need to pause at certain times and redo things or do things differently. So we are engaging quite a bit. So if I look at our recent history, we've had to pivot, and we've had to strengthen our partnerships, for instance, with our tenants. If you think back of COVID, there was a lot of uncertainty, but I think the way the industry worked with the tenants, we ensured that there were limited business closures, and we working together, we ensured that jobs were saved. We have the same sort of engagements with communities. Tim is right. When we do projects, we engage with communities. Over time, the industry has done well to learn this, to communicate with ward councillors, etc. But I just want to bring in a point that Linda and Vuyiswa brought in earlier on. In us trying to respond to communities' needs, we need to obviously, from a shopping point of view, offer a variety of services. Now, when you have a services like Linda does at Unjani Clinics, where you have a clinic at your shopping center, it brings in additional customers to the clinic whilst also delivering services. So it almost acts as a semi-anchor. I mean, I was a center manager of Jabulani Mall over a decade ago. And at Maponya Mall, they had a Tusong center. And I really wanted the Tusong center at Jabulani Mall. And I've been trying for many years, trying to see how we can place some of the Tusong centers at some of our shopping centers. So what they do at those Tusong centers, they've got SASA, you can do your license renewals and other municipal services. And that's an important thing. But I couldn't get a hold of anyone. So I basically called the department. And when I spoke to someone there, and he said, because of budgetary constraints, they've actually stopped that program. And I thought to myself, wow, there is an opportunity for government and shopping centers to partner together, and maybe we can overcome that budgetary constraint. So that's why I think industry bodies like CYBIB and SAPO are important, because they can form that platform or form that bridge that will enable us to communicate.
Yeah, and it's such a beautiful tie back to what Vuyiswa also shared earlier, Vuso, because she was talking about facilitating the conversation, and as you mentioned, SAPAWA and other industry bodies, the ability to close that gap. But maybe, Linda, I want to come back to you again, because I think, you introduced to us Unjani Clinics, and you shared with us some examples of what it actually looks like on the ground when you have your nurses stationed. But I want to maybe unpack it a little bit more. and hear from you what actually drives the success of your clinics. And I'm really asking within the context of being in the retail space in low-income communities versus traditional clinic spaces. What is the differentiator that you think these are the elements that are actually really driving the success of the clinics?
Yeah, I think, if you look at our target market, the Unjani clinics focus on the employed uninsured market, and employed includes the informal sector. So people that have access to some level of funding can't afford to pay medical aid cost every single month, but also can't afford to sit in government queues and wait for days in order for them to get care. That's our target market. And what we find there is that if we can provide that patient with a convenient offering that is on a transport route or is close to their community so that they don't have significant cost to travel, then that's the success of the Unjani clinic model, is that the patient is able to access these services conveniently and at an affordable price. So, through the empowerment of Black women professional nurses, the creation of employment in our communities, and the ability to access these affordable services, you're starting to see more and more people utilizing the Unjani clinic services. So we have 110 facilities across the country. We probably have, I think it's about 16 that are in mall environments, so within a parking lot. And we generally see that the uptake in numbers or the patient numbers that come through those clinics are a little higher than in other community clinics. And we would put that to the shopping center hours. They have convenient shopping center hours. They open longer. You also have, as I mentioned earlier, the transport routes. But certainly we do see higher volumes being driven through our mall locations, because I think it adds that convenience. I think it's critically important that I think Vuso mentioned it, and a number of my other colleagues have. It's about community, and it's about providing the community with a service and convenience for that community. And I think when we look at placing a clinic in a community, it has to be easy for that community to reach. And I think that's critical as well to the numbers we see.
A quick comment, maybe, Linda, on the importance, if any, of an omni-channel approach. I mean, you're talking about service and convenience converging. What role does an omni-channel approach play in that regard?
I think an omni-channel approach is critical if you're focusing on a consumer, in our case, the patient. And we need to ensure that we meet the needs of the patients wherever they are. So be it in a community, be it in a community mall, putting that patient first or that customer first drives volumes, it drives quality, and particularly in our case, the success of the nurses' businesses.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm checking myself is to make sure that the conversation doesn't give off the impression that it's easy. And so, Tim, I want to come to you with this, because I think there might be some hard lessons, some very memorable challenges that you can share with us.
As project managers for a number of developers and listed property funds across Africa on a lot of the developments, we never stop learning. We learn from one country to the next, from one development to the next. To pick up on what Linda was chatting about in terms of the clinics and relating one of the learnings to healthcare in particular, for example, I like what Linda said earlier around, the clinics being in parking lots or within the area of the shopping center, but not necessarily in the shopping center. And one tangible example was a shopping center we did in Harare, where there was a clinic embedded into the mall, quite close to the food and beverage and the restaurant outlets and things like that. And it really impacted on the guys sitting there having a meal with people lining up to go to the clinic, and it doesn't really work. So you need to get that sort of stuff right, and make sure that the access and the egress and the flows are working well from that perspective. The other thing, when we've spoken about it, is transport nodes and ensuring that commuters can get to and from the shopping center, particularly when these shopping centers become the community centers and the centers of action in that particular area. tangible mistake. We went through a design process for one of our clients, designed an integrated shopping center around a taxi rank, but hadn't gone into the detail of unpacking where those taxis actually go to. And it was a long haul taxi rank. And the mistake is that nobody's going to take shopping bags on a long haul taxi. If the taxi rank was short haul, in that community, it would have obviously been a lot more successful for the shopping center. So it's about detail. It's about getting into that detail and making sure that the investigation is done sufficiently.
Tim, I think that's an excellent response, and you're really bringing us to the focus of the design process and who are we designing for and how are we designing for that community member in mind. And so we want to bring you back into the conversation because you were also inviting us to raise our consciousness around the positive and the negative impact. And now that's where I want to go to now. What are some of the big positive or negative impact that retail centers have on communities that you think are going to be important for us to design better and have better impact and really see retail becoming a force for good? And I wonder if you can just also do a quick comment as well on how do we ensure that we have the community at the center of our design process right from the inception and not as an afterthought when all is done?
Those are really excellent questions. I think maybe let me start with the first part of the question, which is really just sort of highlighting what the positives and negatives are, because I do think there are sort of two schools of thought around the role of retail in uplifting communities. And I do believe that on the one hand, yes, retail, big box retail, the type of sort of big mall development retail that we see in townships and local communities has been critiqued for the impact that it has on local entrepreneurship, and on its inability to kind of integrate with local economies. You kind of have these giant malls just almost, falling from the sky, with a whole bunch of different retailers that are national retailers, your national grocery retailers and fashion and whatnot. And that does have an impact on local communities. But on the other side, of course, we also see the positive impact. And I think to give that balanced analysis, we've heard, from some of the other speakers, they are involved in delivering key social services. There's obviously the positive impact of the critical infrastructure and the investment that is made by these developers into the communities. And I think what you're talking about is about conscious development. How do we become more conscious about integrating with communities so that, it doesn't have to be an either or? And that's a topic, of course, that I'm very, very passionate about. So I think there are a number of ways that this can be done, and we'll talk a bit more later about some of the specific kind of success stories that we've seen. But I think on a more broader level, I think what retailers really need to start becoming a lot more conscious of is integrating local content into the tenant mix. Vuso spoke a bit about this earlier. Recently, actually this weekend, I was in Limpopo, in the Botlekwa region. And I know Fortress actually does have a center there. And what you notice in a lot of these centers is that you'll have kind of the main shopping center, and right outside the main shopping center is like where the real economic hub is. That's where the local fruit and vegetable sellers are, and the spaza shops and the people selling the spadlo and whatever other, local foods and local fast food, if you want to call it that. Whereas inside is kind of all your national, big retail chains, etc. And I'm saying there's definitely something that's missing there. And we need to find a way as local retailers to be more responsive, more consumer and community-led, and less kind of, I'd call it, developer-led. And I think that requires a much greater level of integration and understanding of the community upfront. I love the example. I thought it was quite humorous, the example that Tim made in his previous statement, just talking about that issue with the taxis. And I think those are common mistakes that can happen, and that do happen when you're kind of operating externally and not necessarily integrated into the community. You miss those nuances. So we have to start asking ourselves the question of, why is it actually that every mall that comes up in a township or in a rural area, why is it that immediately after you see a kind of microeconomy emerging right outside? What can we do better to create formalized spaces for these people, is actually there an opportunity to generate some non-GLA income from some of these tenants, from some of these retailers, because they are actually making money. They are credible businesses. Why do we spend money on enterprise development, in these, for everybody else, where the real enterprise and the real business is right there, right outside the shopping center, right within the very same community that we speak about?
I think you've raised such important questions that I want to put them to Vuso, because I think you're asking the questions that Vuso should be answering, and I almost feel like my job is done here. So Vuso, let's bring your voice into the conversation a little bit more. Some reaction to what you're hearing from Vuyiswa, and some of your own thoughts around this, the consciousness around both the positive and the negative, but also the mainstream economy and the microeconomy that are in duality in these different spaces.
So before I answer those questions directly, I want to respond to what you said when you introduced Tim earlier on, to say that you don't want to create a perception that it's easy to do these developments. You're quite right, it's not easy. However, we need to also realize that the shopping center industry and the retail industry at large is not insignificant in the South African context. I read somewhere that the retail sector employs about 21% of the workforce in South Africa. It's about the fourth largest employer in the country. Now, from my point of view, there's a rule of thumb that we use in the industry, and I've tested it, it works. And people who know me will say I'm a broken record because I say it, but I think it's important. For every 30 to 40 square meters in a shopping center, the industry creates one job. That's the case in South Africa, and that's the case overseas. So it's in everyone's interest to develop shopping centers to address the problem that we've got of unemployment. For an example, at Everton Mall, that center is 35,000 squares, and over 800 people are employed there on a daily basis. Now that excludes the construction work that happens before the center's built. So if we're talking about job creation in South Africa, this is one of the industry that we can work together, both the private and public sector can work together to improve. I mean, just one example, we're talking earlier on about engagement. One example of this is, at the moment, we're busy redeveloping one of our center. And in this construction period, we employ over 100 people currently. Now, the nature of construction is that it's temporary work. Now, in the area where we are, there's a lot of services that need to be improved, and that's on the public sector sphere. Why could we not get together with the public sector and say, we're employing these people, upskilling them in construction? There are all these other projects that you can engage. Can we not work together and sort of plan together so that there's a continuity and build up of skills? So I think that's the one part. And coming to your question of, is it easy? It's not easy. So Tim talked about construction mafias earlier on. We've got skills issues or skills shortages that we've got in the industry. But the major issue for me, or the major constraint to the development of shopping centers, is that we are in an environment where administrative costs are going up, construction costs are going up, electricity costs are going up. It's becoming increasingly difficult to making shopping center schemes viable. So that is slowing down the development of shopping centers. So if we, and that all comes down to a lack of economic growth. If we are serious about creating jobs, we have to be serious and be purposeful in growing the economy. And a place to start is to implement the recommendation of the National Development Plan that was drawn up some time ago. So I think that's very important. We need economic growth to drive employment, And that will solve a lot of our social issues, I believe. Now, we were talking to Vusa mentioned the shopping centers working together with other stakeholders in the communities. Quite correct. We did a study some time ago, and we found that 30% of the people who shop at our shopping centers also shop at informal traders outside the shopping centers. Now, how do you develop that further? And I think that's where engagement again with us in government is important. Again, I'll give you an example. So we've got a shopping center and a lot of hawkers and informal traders on the outside. And we've been trying to build structures for them. But, you know, when you call a meeting with them, strangely, they don't attend the meetings. And what we found is that a lot of the people who are engaged in that are actually foreign traders. And they fear that if we try to formalize them, we'll kill their business. So you've got to ask the question, how do we get government involved with us, together with the traders, to help develop those industries? I think it's quite important. We can work very well together. I think I mentioned earlier on that shopping centers need variety. So the fact that the informal traders are sitting outside the shopping center or next to the shopping center, it's just more variety. It helps, it makes a node. It helps improve that node. So the shopping center doesn't survive by itself. The hawkers don't survive by themselves. We need to work together and build something that can work together.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent nuance that you brought into the conversation. And I had intended to ask you about the growth of SMEs and entrepreneurs in and around these spaces. And I think you've spoken to that as you speak about a node. And of course, the bigger picture, which is, of course, job creation and growth, and that being exceptionally important. So what I'd like you to do, Vuso, maybe just a quick comment around your view on the growth of SMEs, entrepreneurial ventures in and around the retail space, and what does that actually mean for traditional retail?
I think traditional retail, by its nature, as I mentioned, will always evolve because we need to respond to what the consumers are wanting. If we don't respond, the industry will die. And I think I don't see that happening. I think there's going to be continuous evolvement. So SMEs bring variety, and it's important that we grow them. Unfortunately, in South Africa, we do not, particularly in the market, the lower income market, there isn't a great number of people that are coming through as entrepreneurs in the SMEs that want to come into shopping centers. And one needs to ask themselves why that is. A few years ago, the Gauteng government did a study, and they found that in South Africa, we have a very, relative to other developing countries, we have a smaller number of people wanting to be entrepreneurs. And where they do become entrepreneurs is mostly in the retail sector. And the main reason for that is skills and skill shortages. So there's room for people to be trained in business and to create businesses. You know, one of the issues that I'll give you another example. You know, one of the sectors that's growing very well in South Africa currently is the pharmaceutical sector. You'll know that all these guys are busy opening shops. However, when you speak to them, they'll tell you that one of the problems that we've got is that there aren't enough pharmacists in South Africa. So they struggle with that. So in my view, and that's just one example, there should be a concerted effort to be training pharmacists. There should be a concerted effort to be training entrepreneurs to bring variety.
Vuso, I think where you've landed us is really on a whole of society approach. And what I'm really hearing is that all stakeholders really need to step into the conversational space. You're talking about a lot of engagement, a lot of communication. I think this conversation would be incomplete if we didn't speak about the pandemic. And so, Linda, let me bring your voice in very quickly. How has the pandemic shifted the need and concern for easier and better access to healthcare, especially in the rural areas for you?
Thanks, Nozi. Yeah, we can't, after this new normal, not bring in the pandemic. And I think from our perspective, healthcare, the need for healthcare, particularly primary healthcare, has been something that has existed pre-COVID and will exist post-COVID. I think COVID has just exacerbated the need in our communities. One of the important things that has been a theme throughout our conversation today has been the partnerships. And I think we can all say as South Africans that had it not been for partnerships, public, private, NGOs throughout the COVID pandemic in various ways, we would not have got through the pandemic the way that we have. So partnerships are critical in everybody's lives. And I think even in our context, the health context, the Sustainable Development Goals, Partnerships for Goals is critical. That's number 17. And I just think in terms of the partnerships we've had with the malls for our clinics has added to that. So, while the clinics were impacted in the mall centres with the hard lockdowns because people couldn't go to the malls, we continued to operate through the pandemic, and all of our clinics have remained open. I think we can talk to the fact that the fact that we haven't actually closed any clinics, that we've managed to operate throughout it. Our low infection rates are indicative of good controls and proper infection control, as well as sanitization protocols. I think, we've all worked together to achieve what we've managed to. But the need for alternative, healthcare provision is critical, especially as we move towards NHI. And I just think, we've got a role to play as Unjani clinics, and I think there's a lot more that can be done in terms of partnering more malls and providing more convenient care to our patients.
Yeah, Linda, I almost hear you say that one of the impacts of the pandemic has been a shift in mindset for all of us, even in how we approach partnerships, a much bigger openness to finding innovative ways of working together, which is really exciting. But Tim, I think I want to go back to an earlier comment, and I think it was Vuyiswa who made the comment to say it's also important as we think about partnerships that government play their role and they step into the game more proactively. But in the same vein, I want to almost go to the other side of the coin and say, where do you think the missed opportunities to work closer with government and to work closer with communities have been?
Nozi, I'm going to be a little bit controversial here because I do think, the elephant in the room is the challenges that we're having with government. I mean, ourselves as Profrica, we do some consulting work for Fortress, and the challenges that we have are getting rights in place, getting approvals for services, trying to get developments going, which can benefit the communities. And that is a real challenge. The majority of private developments that are happening, the private developers actually having to fund the services to be brought to the property, which should be governments. That's what government and municipalities should be doing. They should be bringing the services to the property to allow the developer to undertake the developments and pay rates and taxes back to them. But that's not happening. And the more, unfortunately, the more we engage and the more we try and get too involved with government on some of these things, we are finding a lot of stumbling blocks and roadblocks that are scuppering the process. So I often think that sometimes it's better to be a little bit under the radar, focus on what you need to do, and get the development going. And only once it's going and it's got an impact in the community, then you've got a little bit more power to start engaging and start creating a bit more of that public-private partnership. So I'm talking from a personal experience perspective. I know it's a bit controversial, but those are the challenges that we are having.
But can I support you on that, Tim? It's important, and I want to bring some numbers to it. So you're talking about delays in development. There's a development that we wanted to do in KZN. We started the process about 10 years ago, and we didn't get the necessary approvals, and we sort of pended it. And then we started again 2 years ago. It went around getting a water use license. Now, since we started the process about 2 years ago, we've only just a few months ago received that approval. Now, if you think about it, if you use that rule of thumb that I was saying, 1 per 40 squares or 30 squares, we have delayed over 200 jobs because of this water use license delay. Now, that's not taking into account the construction jobs that would have been drawn up. So we do need to find a way of making it easier for doing development in South Africa. So I just wanted to support Tim on that.
Yeah, it's quite sobering, Vuso, when you put it, the trade-off or what's left on the table, and you put it in the number of jobs that have not been created, when we all know that that should be the number one priority in terms of resetting the economy and really getting people into employment. And that's really, really sobering. But Vuso, I maybe want to just bring in your voice here and say, I'm trying to make sure that we don't end on a note of doom and gloom, even if it's a note of reality. And the question to you is, where have you seen partnerships succeed? And it doesn't have to be a local example, it could be a global example. Where have you seen it work and work really well? More importantly, what needs to be true in South Africa for us to have the same reality?
The first question really is kind of, when you say successful, what does success mean? And I think we all have different definitions of what success looks like or what success means. But certainly my definition is a community, or a development rather, that is well integrated into the community, a development that drives local entrepreneurship and, of course, stimulates the local economy. Certainly job creation is top of the agenda, but I do want to stress that it's not the only agenda. I think we have to also go back to what Tim spoke about, is how do we create spaces that communities have a sense of ownership about? And how do we create spaces that communities have pride about and that they can be involved in at all levels? So from actual real ownership to that sense of ownership, as well as to driving entrepreneurship. And I think there's a lot of international examples, and actually a lot of examples on the continent. I think in other African cities, we see this a lot better because I suppose they don't necessarily have the historical context that we have in South Africa around the spatial development issues that we have. China is also a very good example. Last time I traveled to China, and particularly in the Guangzhou region, which is a big manufacturing hub, the way they design retail spaces is actually much more smaller boxes. So essentially you have kind of a mixed use of manufacturing and retail development, where small scale manufacturers are then able to have immediate access to market by having sort of small retail cubicles or kiosks within a much broader development. Now that moves away from our kind of standard South African understanding of, you've got to have a big anchor tenant, national footprint, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying there isn't a space for that, but I'm saying that I think we are at a point in our economic journey as a country where we have to start thinking differently, and we have to start, picking up on those other models of development. 21 Boxes is another development in Melville in Johannesburg. And look, it's a lot more conceptual because they were kind of going for that look. But I think what you immediately see in a development like that is it puts SMEs and entrepreneurs and local makers at the heart of the development. There are no anchor tenants actually in that development. And I think it's had a lot of significant impact on the community, both kind of how they use the space, but also on the entrepreneurship aspect. So I certainly think that there's success stories. Alex Mall is another great example of how you can create that sense of ownership in a community. They've kind of brought the elements of telling the story of Alex and the founders of Alex, the entrepreneurs, the success stories of Alex, and they've put pictures of all of these people in the tiles of the actual shopping center. And these are how they've managed to sort of create that sense of ownership. But at an actual sort of ownership perspective, you also have local entrepreneurs who are co-owners of the actual shopping center itself. So, you have a completely different relationship as a shopping center with the community, with government, with all the broader stakeholders through how the whole thing has been thought through and designed. And I think really that's where we need to be starting to look at as retailers. Of course, we've also spoken about the online, we spoke about omni-channels, but I'm going to refer more to the sort of online retailing. There's a positioning that online retailing is a potential threat to retail. And I'm actually saying, I think there's a huge opportunity to bring, that sort of last mile delivery points into rural retail development. So in rural areas and townships, you can't necessarily always do door-to-door online delivery. So how do we use existing retail spaces to actually be those last mile delivery points, and maybe, work closer with the different platforms like your Takealots or whatever to actually create that opportunity. Again, like Vuso said, ultimately we're bringing more feet into the center, but we are serving people in the manner that they actually need and not simply in the manner that is kind of what we know and what we've always done for the last 100 years. And I'm really hoping that we'll start to see that more in how developments are planned in South Africa.
So I'm loving where this conversation is going, because we're getting very practical and very real about, the possibilities on the ground of what we've seen and what we can build and scale. So Tim, let me quickly bring in your voice. I know you had wanted to lean into this part of the conversation as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I loved what Vuyiswa said about the aspect of the different ways of trading and the different retail options. And I just wanted to add some of my experiences in Kigali in Rwanda as an example. There's a 5-story building, which is a co-op basically, and the formal traders all came together and they actually bought and they paid a contractor to build them a 5-story building so they could all have their various own trading outlets through that. So there's so much power in community and collaboration when that sort of stuff happens. So I did want to caveat my doom and gloom note about government with a positive aspect, and that's really engaging with the community and being specific about where the particular developments are. We're seeing a lot of, as I spoke earlier about the nodes, but a lot of social housing opportunities coming up in and around retail nodes and creating more of a mixed use environment, more of a 24/7 type of node in these CBDs, particularly in peri-urban and rural areas. And it's really about that. You can't just have one use. If you could have all the uses there, we spoke earlier about offices and residential and everything, more densification and that integration of uses. For me, that's low-hanging fruit.
This has been a beautiful part of the conversation where we've looked to global examples, we've found continental examples, we've found local examples of what's possible when we all are working together, when we are tackling the difficult conversations around the participation or lack thereof of government, what happens when that participation does come through. So perhaps as a way of closing it off, Vuso, I want us to maybe talk a little bit about the community and their understanding of the value of retail's contribution to their communities. And if there's a gap in terms of that appreciation of that value, how do we begin to close that gap?
I think there is a gap, but I think that gap is beginning to close. So if you look at what happened after the riots last year in July, if you look at the taxi associations or the taxi operators, they came together and they realized that we are in this together. Our success it affects their success, and their success affects our success. And they came out and they said that they started actually working together with our security guards to help defend the centers during that process. That's on the taxi association side or taxi operators. But even on the community side, more recently, in fact, about a month ago, we are busy with developing a shopping center here in Gauteng. And we had some community issues with some instigators. But people, without us as the shopping center owners driving it or being involved, there's a community WhatsApp group. People got onto that WhatsApp group and the community actually assembled at our shopping center and they said, this is our center, you will not cause disruption here. So I think there is a sense of, or at least a realization that we are in this together. I do think, though, that the shopping center industry needs a lot more PR. We need to spread this awareness and show how these shopping centers contribute positively to these communities. And that is starting to happen now.
So on the note of PR, we're going to close this conversation on a note of PR because Vuso has taken us to public relations. And so we're going to try and close it in a fun way. And I want us to think, I'm going to put you all on the spot. And I want you to think if you were the head of a PR agency and you needed to come up with one strapline that really captures the opportunity of what is possible when retail is a force for good. So we're talking a big billboard outside a mall in a local community, and it's one sentence. So it's not an executive summary. It is not a paragraph. It is not a page. It is literally one billboard right outside the mall in the taxi rank. What does that billboard say? And I'm going to help you a little bit because your billboard needs to start with these two words, retail can, and then you get to complete the sentence, retail can. So in this part, I always look to see who looks away from me because that means they are the most nervous. So I'm going to go with the person who looks the least nervous. Linda, you seem to have got this. Retail can, what does your billboard say?
Retail can give communities what they need.
Retail can give communities what they need. Tim, what does your billboard say?
Retail can do it for us. Let's do it together.
Retail can do it for us. Let's do it together. So I'm going to come to you next. Retail can.
Retail can empower.
Love that. Retail can empower. 3 words. So I don't know if you're going to do any better than that, but let's give it a shot. Retail can.
Retail can, comma, when we work together, drive growth in South Africa.
Retail can, when we work together, drive growth in South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure having this conversation, really dealing with both the positives, the negatives, going into the nuances, and really asking the question, how can retail play its role as a force for good in 2022 and beyond? And how do we do it in a way that makes commercial sense for everyone? Well, that's it from us. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation, and we certainly hope to see you again very soon. And don't forget, if you liked what you heard today, you can access more growth-empowering insights by giving Fortress REIT Limited a follow on LinkedIn. It's goodbye for now.